This programme was produced at and first aired on MPR, Manawatu People's Radio, with support from New Zealand On Air. Ka pai Irarangi Te Motu, MPR.
Kia ora and welcome to Reserved Recommendations. This is a show about great trash, difficult art, and our complicated relationships with art and culture. My name's Hugh, I'm the host of the show, and I'd like to take this opportunity to put in a very mild content warning for the show as a whole. Sometimes our recommendations on this show are reserved just because the thing that we're discussing is in some way not good, but sometimes there are aspects of the art or artist that may be confronting for some people. Check the episode descriptions for more information, and do be aware of your listening environment. This evening I am joined by Michiel Verkade. Pleasure to talk to you again, Michiel, after a very long time. Too long, I think. How's it going?
Kia ora. I'm well, thank you, Hugh. Yeah, as you say, it has been a long time, but great to talk to you again.
Yeah, and an auspicious topic. This is a band that I have a great deal of affection for, and the reservations I would have in recommending them to people is they're in some ways one of those bands who are like 5 to 10 different bands depending on which period you pick, and also their legacy amongst other things is marked by a certain tendency to self-indulgence, I would suggest, which, I mean, it means you have to get on their level and be prepared to deal with a certain amount of their bullshit in order to enjoy it some of the time, I think. We're talking about the Grateful Dead, so thank you for suggesting that. Do you maybe want to, lead off with your connection to the Grateful Dead? Because I got into them kind of sideways through the movie about Dave Grisman, who is Jerry Garcia's mandolin player mate.
So it's your father's fault.
It is, yeah. He took me to the movie, and my brother, to the movie Grateful Dog, which is about Jerry Garcia's other career as a bluegrass player, and his relationship with the mandolin player Dave Grisman, who's called Dog in the movie. And off the back of that, we went, oh, we should get some Grateful Dead records. And then we did, and it was good. But how did you find your way in?
Yeah, well, that's a long time ago, in the mid-90s, I think. So when I was first at university, towards the end of my high school life, I was listening to a lot of 1960s music. I listened to the classic hits radio stations of the time. So the classic hits kind of in those days were the 50s, 60s and 70s. And kind of as time has progressed, they've gone ever more into the future. So you can hardly on those classic hits station hear any 60s music anymore. But I got interested, probably in the Beatles. And then I got interested in the San Francisco sound through Jefferson Airplane, which is what got me started down that. And that was at university in the 90s in Auckland. And then I came across the Grateful Dead. And I think they've got so much to listen to that you can spend a lifetime listening. And you can't say that about the Grateful Dead. About the Jefferson Airplane, and you really don't want to be listening to Starship, and you might want to listen to Jefferson Starship, but that wouldn't engage you as much as the Grateful Dead does.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, you mentioned Jefferson Airplane, Starship. Of course, they've got an album where they credit Jerry Garcia with, is it like spiritual advice or something? Because he
that's right. Yeah,
gave an offhanded comment that it sounded as surrealistic as a pillow, and so they named it Surrealistic Pillow, and then gave him that weird cryptic credit in the liner notes.
Well, it's not only that, they were kind of playing on each other's records all the time as well. So in those days, the record companies were a bit more proprietorial about who played on which records. So I think they had to be a bit more careful and couch it in those kind of terms. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's where I was going. Is that there are all of these bands that come out of the kind of Haight-Ashbury, San Francisco scene, and I think it's easy to forget sometimes that that was an incredibly small geographical area to start with, and so all of these guys knew each other. The Dead had a relationship with Crosby, Stills and Nash, who taught them harmony singing in exchange for Jerry Garcia playing pedal steel on some Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young
Yeah,
songs.
Teach Your Children. That's the famous one. Yep.
And they had this relationship with Jefferson, and then a lot of kind of less well remembered bands as well were all kind of part of this quite small and interconnected group.
That's for sure. I mean, even the Airplane and the Dead played softball semi-competitively against each other. And I imagine that would have been quite hilarious to watch. But yeah, they were quite close. And as you say, a very close-knit community in the Haight-Ashbury. But maybe we want to go to the genesis of the band. What do you reckon?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So you've already talked about Jerry Garcia's bluegrass, and that's probably how he entered the music scene. So he was a singer and a lead guitarist for the Grateful Dead. And I'll just name some of the other members. I'm not going to name them all. I think it's best to go and name the core members. And you'll notice that there's two drummers, and we'll talk about that possibly later. So the next member, I think, chronologically, is Bob Ware, sometimes called Bobby, and he played rhythm guitar and vocals. Not really sure of his musical background, but he liked rock and roll. He had a thing for Chuck Berry, so that quite often you'll find a lot of Chuck Berry on the set list, and he sang their cowboy songs. Yeah. Oh, what one interesting thing about Bob Ware was he was expelled from most of the schools in his areas, and he was a very nice young man and very attractive looking.
He's now got a rather spectacular set of mutton chops. If you look up pictures of him now, he looks like what's that famous cow? Is it Sam Elliott, the cowboy actor?
Yeah, if you took a black and white portrait of him, it wouldn't look out of place in the speaker's corridor or next to all the portraits of the old prime ministers.
Yeah.
So one of the other ones is the Phil Lesh, the bass player. He had quite a idiosyncratic bass style. He had previously played orchestral trumpet, and he was interested in avant-garde classical music and free jazz. So you might want to say some more about his jazz playing, but it is not at all prototypical rock and roll bass.
No. So, I mean, in another life, sometimes I am a bass player, and the thing that most self-taught bass players do is that they learn to follow the root note, which is, the tonic note of a chord, and then depending on what the chord is, whether it's major or minor or whatever, you add like a second or a third note to vary the pattern up a bit, following kind of the character of the chord. But often what Phil Lesh will do is he'll play like a counterpoint to something that Jerry Garcia is doing, or he'll like drop big chords in, which is quite an unusual thing because double stopping on a bass sounds all right, but chords often sound not good because of the ways that frequencies work together when they're very low as opposed to when they're kind of in the mid-range where a guitar sits. So yeah, he's a very unusual bass player.
Yeah, and there's a very famous kind of bass bomb in the other one as kind of the intro where there's a really heavy buddha and it goes but he brings a lot to the band, I think, and to their sound. Next, one of the beloved first members of the band was Ron Pigpen McKernan. He grew up in a household that was filled with blues and rhythm and blues music. His father was a DJ, and he had like this really tough, bikey look, but that belied his real nature. He was a real teddy bear of a guy, but he had a real stage presence as a kind of white blues performer. Yeah, so as he sadly died quite early in the early 70s.
And kind of set an unfortunate precedent for like playing keys or piano in the Grateful Dead being kind of a death sentence. They in the way that some bands go through drummers, or I think isn't Metallica goes through bassists. Grateful Dead rely more than you would think, given that the kind of the star of the band is a virtuoso lead guitar player, but they rely more than you would think on having a really good pianist or keys player, and those guys tend to have unpleasant fates, which is it's a thing.
Yeah, that's right. Please don't ask me to list all the keyboardists and
No,
distinguish
there
them.
were a few.
Yeah, but Pigpen played more a kind of Hammond organ sound, just to describe that, and that really went with his kind of blues persona. So one of the drummers, the first drummer, was called Bill Kreutzmann. Oh, he's still called Bill Kreutzmann, and he came from kind of a solid drumming background. He enjoyed jazz and funk, and in his youth at high school, I don't know quite how this happened, but he met Aldous Huxley, and Huxley encouraged him to keep up with the drums. Now, Huxley was a descendant of Darwin's bulldog, his famous defender, and so Huxley came from a famous family. He was a essayist himself, and possibly you might know him mostly for that novel Brave New World.
He also wrote. Is it an essay or a non-fiction novella called The Doors of Perception, which is where the Doors get their name from? The Doors, the band.
Indeed, but that title wasn't his own either, because that came from a William Blake poem. Yeah, I think The Songs of Innocence, but I don't. Yeah, I'd have to look that up. But
not a Blake scholar in any sense, so I cannot correct you one way or the other.
No. Okay, and then we're getting to the end here of the members. Is Mickey Hart. He joined a little later than the others. He was also a drummer, but he was really interested in this type of drumming called rudimentary drumming, which I don't really quite understand it, but it sounds like people just stuck to what the rudiments of drumming was and just doing tons of practice and stuff. It sounds a bit like drumming in a pipe band or something.
Yeah,
I'm not really sure.
My understanding is that in drumming, a rudiment is like, have you heard like terms like flam and diddle and paradiddle? Those are all terms for like specific patterns that you can hit the drums in, and they're called rudiments. And in a marching band, like you say, where you've got basically a 2/4 rhythm to work with. So if you just played the beat, you'd go mad. You put in a lot of these rudiments to like accent things and push them along.
Yeah, my son, he's a drummer, and I try to press him to listen to more music and stuff, and he doesn't seem to do that, which is a bit of a shame. I hope at some stage he takes flight and does actually listen, and watch a pipe band go down the street and see what they're doing and think, hey, what's going on there? Because as you say, they do some really interesting stuff. Yeah. Right. So we've gone through the main kind of core group, and there's two others possibly that we mention. Normally in bands you wouldn't list the lyricist, but I think in the Grateful Dead you can. And in fact, Robert Hunter, who is their primary lyricist, is included in the group. And I'm not so sure about John Perry Barlow, but anyway. But we'll start with Robert Hunter. Robert Hunter really, I think, is important for the Grateful Dead. He developed along with the band, starting kind of with their psychedelic sound. So if you have a look at the earlier songs like China Cat, Sunflower, then you get this really intense, really full line that's just full of imagery and also too many breaths in a line and very difficult to sing.
Yes.
And then later on you see it relax a bit more and go more towards a folk or country idiom, a lot more relaxed, dealing a lot more subtly with the line and yeah, it just
and the
great Americana type stuff. Yeah.
The thing with the Grateful Dead for a lot of their career was that they had this sort of large, somewhat organized tribe of people all living communally or semi-communally. And so while Robert Hunter wasn't a singer or an instrumentalist, he was like a live-in songwriter who there are accounts. Now I've read a couple of different books and I can't remember which one it's from, but there are accounts of like that he gave to one of the books that I read of, Jerry would be downstairs practicing scales and chord patterns, and Hunter would be in the room immediately above working on lyrics, and so it would be kind of bleeding into each other constantly. They're kind of living in each other's pockets a lot more than I'm thinking of like another songwriting team like Elton John and what's his name, the guy who writes all
Taupin,
the words.
Is it?
Sorry,
is it Taupin?
Yeah, Bernie Taupin. I don't think that they ever had quite that intense or close of a relationship.
Yeah, I don't think it was always like that, but there were certainly periods when they were living together, and there were other times, like I think Hunter sent them Alligator, I think was the first that he sent them, and he was amazed to hear that for the first time. Yeah, so against that, against Robert Hunter, now he primarily worked with Jerry Garcia and they were a songwriting duo, I think a very strong one for the band. Hunter would work with other members of the band, and he did work with Bobby Ware a couple of times. And in fact, there's this really great song called goodness me, Sugar Magnolia.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's fantastic, but Bob added an extra verse, which to Hunter's ear didn't have a romantic enough sound for the song. So it made a kind of romantic imagery out of a Jeep. And the image was of being able to jump a Jeep because you knew how to play the gears with it. To change the gears, and supposedly this you could do in the early Jeeps. But Hunter didn't like it, and he didn't like that Bob took his lyrics and played with them like that. So he decided never to do that again. So Ware took up with another, with a friend, I think from way back of his, called John Perry Barlow. John Perry Barlow is an excellent chap for a couple of reasons. He's a rancher and poet, and obviously lyricist of the Grateful Dead, but he is also a electronics rights activist, and he co-founded the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which
fantastic.
is a digital rights organization in the United States and further abroad. Yeah, so possibly you didn't know that, Hugh, by the sound of your reaction.
No, I didn't know that he was tied up with those guys.
Yeah, I don't think you listen to enough of Cory Doctorow's podcasts.
I
Otherwise, you
do,
might
but
know
I
that one.
didn't. I hadn't heard one of his ones about Barlow. So that's fascinating.
Yeah, because they obviously work close together. Because Doctorow worked at the EFF, or is still involved. Now. Right. Yeah. So those are the members of the band, and I'm at your disposal. Where do you want to head off now?
Well, I think what we might do is we might actually play our first song, and maybe that can be your pick. And I guess there are a couple of different things to talk about with it. One is that the Dead have lots of different modes, but there are probably two main modes that they're best known for, and one is as like a psychedelic rock band from the heyday of psychedelic rock, and the other is sort of like a roots country band, or a jug band was what they evolved out of by kind of adding more members. And this song that you had lined up, and we could talk a bit about the history of it as well after we played it maybe, but it's got kind of a bit more of that loping country thing going on with it. So this is the new Speedway Boogie.
Please don't dominate the rap, Jack, if you got nothing new to say. If you please don't back up the track, this train's got to run today. I spent a little time on the mountain, spent a little time on the hill. Heard some say better run away, others say better stand still. Now I don't know, but I've been told it's hard to run with the weight of gold. On the other hand, I heard it said it's just as hard with the weight of lead. Who can deny, it's not just a change in style. One step done and another begun, and I wonder how many miles. I spent a little time on the mountain, spent a little time on the hill. Things went down we don't understand, but I think in time we will. Now I don't know, but I was told in the heat of the sun a man died of cold. Keep on coming on, stand and wait with the sun so dark and the hour so late. You can't overlook the blackjack of any other highway you ride. It's got no signs or dividing lines and very few rules to guide. I spent a little time on the mountain, I spent a little time on the hill. I saw things getting out of hand, I guess they always will. Now I don't know, but I've been told if the horse don't pull, you got to carry the load. I don't know whose back's that strong, maybe find out before too long. One way or another, one way or another, one way or another, this darkness got to give. One way or another, one way or another, one way or another, this darkness got got to give. One way or another, one way or another, one way or another, this darkness got to be.
That was a new Speedway Boogie by the Grateful Dead. That was Michael's pick. I've picked a track as well, which we will get to probably in the second half. And I guess one of the things I wanted to talk about as a way of, that was a song, was a way of leading into it, was that song's kind of a somewhat rare example of the Dead outright commenting on things going on around them. They were a famously kind of apolitical band in the sense that they had ideas about things, but they often didn't make those into coherent political stances. But there were.
Yeah, I think that's a more fair way of putting it. I mean, they didn't go and sing songs about revolution and include "Up Against the Wall, Motherfucker" and that kind of thing like the Jefferson Airplane did. But they had a conscience, a political conscience, and but yeah, they didn't wear it on their sleeve so much. No. And that song in particular was. About might be too strong a word, but certainly inspired by their experience playing at the Altamont Rock Festival, which is, if people aren't familiar with it, a rock festival that was it the Rolling Stones set up, or were they just instrumental in organising it? Yeah, well, it was between initially the Dead and the Rolling Stones that they thought they'd do this free concert, but the problem was that they had to keep it quiet until quite close to when it happened, and then they had this place organized, but then the place folded because they realized, it's going to be the Stones and it'll be milling with people. So they managed to get it at this speedway, the Altamont Speedway, which is a bit closer to the old stomping grounds of some of the members of the Grateful Dead near Palo Alto, which is I believe in the Silicon Valley area now.
Yeah.
And there was this relationship between the band and the Hells Angels. I find it a little inexplicable to kind of explain, and it's a bit difficult to go backwards, but yeah, they had it. It happened through the acid tests, and that, which we might go into later. But so this was in the genesis of the band, that somehow that they did have a relationship with these bikies and didn't perceive of them as that dangerous as at this event at Altamont they turned out to be. So the Hells Angels were acting as security. And during a performance, I forget whose actually, they beat a man
according
to
to
death.
legend, it's the Stones who were on stage, but I don't know if that's factual or just kind of.
No, I think that makes sense. The Grateful Dead have been involved in organising the event, decided after they saw Jefferson Airplane performance and some people getting beaten up in the crowd, which was massive, that they wouldn't play. I mean, it happened that Marty Balin, one of the singers for the Jefferson Airplane, jumped into the crowd to pull a Hells Angel off someone that the Hells Angel was beating, and consequently was made unconscious himself by this guy, and they had to kind of pick him up and lift him back onto the stage. But so it was a real messed up event, and I think there was a bit of difficulty in trying to figure out who absolving blame and that sort of thing, and I think that's possibly a bit what that's taken up in the song, the Speedway Boogie that you just heard.
Yeah, and I think it's emblematic of a certain kind of, or a certain element of the milieu that that these people were operating in, that there was a certain kind of, part of it, I suspect, is just down to the fact that they were interested in drugs, which meant dealing with people who handled drugs, which meant dealing with criminals. But there was a certain kind of like outlaw vibe, and I think one way of putting it might be that there was a difficulty in working out what sorts of outlawry were like acceptable, and what sorts of people were genuinely dangerous and unpleasant people who you couldn't be around.
I suspect you're right that like it's counter and opposite to the kind of straight society, and so who's our enemy's enemy is our friend kind of thing. I think that's what it was about. But I think too the angels were around during the acid trips, the acid tests, sorry, which were organized events, and so that they got to be trusted in that way, just by having been around, and they let them down on this occasion.
Yeah, and one of the things that kind of comes up on if you read accounts of people who were involved with the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood during the late 60s, leading into what people call the Summer of Love, one of the things that comes back again and again was that it was a very close-knit and quite small group of people in quite a small geographical area, and then it got flooded with an enormous number of people from outside. And so I think the other thing that you're probably seeing is that there were a set of norms and ways of being that worked when it was quite feasible for you to know everyone who was involved and know what they were like and who could be trusted with what, which broke down when you had a huge influx of people from outside, some of whom had bad intentions and some of whom just didn't really know what their intentions were at all.
Yeah, so you've got that original kind of bohemian Haight-Ashbury set, because you've got the Haight-Ashbury was, if you kind of think of it like North Dunedin, old wooden villas, pretty run down, pretty cheap, so people can go live there and not spend too much. And then you've got the burgeoning scene and the songs like Be Sure to Wear a Flower in Your Hair if you go to San Francisco, and just it being in the news about the hippie scene in San Francisco, and then every blimmin' 16-year-old runaway goes to the Haight, and then you've got those problems you just described. But there were kind of social support structures too, like there was a charity they called themselves the Diggers, and they are named after an old Protestant sect from England, but they were involved in getting food together, and they also had some gigs on the Panhandle, which is a street or something in San Francisco, or at Golden Gate Park, and the Dead would play there too. Yeah.
From memory, the Diggers got quite disillusioned with it as well, though. They were the people who did the like big Death of Hippie parade to kind of signify how disgusted they were with the whole thing. All right. Yeah. I think what we will do is we will take our halfway break about now, and when we come back, maybe we'll talk a bit about kind of the progression of the Dead's career, because we've talked a bit about kind of the milieu that they came out of, but one of the things that is kind of strange and striking about them is that they stuck together for a very long time with almost unchanged lineup, and continued kind of mutating and changing all the way through. So we will talk about that in just a second, right after this.
Support this show and others like it by giving a donation. For more information, go to www.mpr.nz/donate.
And we're back. You're listening to Reserved Recommendations. This is a radio show and podcast produced by Manawatu People's Radio Te Reo Irirangi o ngā tangata o Manawatu with the support of New Zealand On Air, so cheers for that, guys. This evening I am talking to my friend Michiel Verkade. We're talking about the Grateful Dead, and just before the break I was saying that one of the things about the Dead which is so unusual is that they had this incredibly long career. The band only broke up in, is it 1995 when Jerry Garcia died?
Yep.
And they ran pretty much uninterrupted from their inception through to then with almost the same lineup the whole time, and kind of continued changing and mutating and experimenting. So, I think we can talk a bit about that. We talked a bit about the kind of the country mode and the psychedelic kind of acid rock mode.
Yep.
But there's this whole kind of jazz thing they did as well. I'm struggling to find my best way into it because it's so expansive. But
I don't quite know how to describe it either. I mean, so you've got them starting off in the second folk renaissance there from the early 60s. We will not go into the first folk renaissance, will we? No. And then they saw the Beatles and thought, hey, we can do that and people like us. So they got their rock and roll groove on.
And actually,
and then they got involved with the acid test that I was talking about. They were held by the Merry Pranksters, at whose nexus or core was Ken Kesey, the author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, who kind of funded that group. And so, I don't know, would you say the Merry Pranksters were a self-exploration group which used LSD as their means of self-exploration? Would that be fair?
I think that is part of it, but the prankster part of the Merry Pranksters was also that they were. I think there's this attitude that you find again and again with the people who encountered psychedelic drugs quite early in their kind of public knowledge, that they became quite evangelistic about it. Like, I'm thinking about, there's another episode where I talked about Jodorowsky, the filmmaker, who set out to create movies that would have the same effect as taking psychedelic drugs because he thought it was so important that people have that experience. And the pranksters were notorious both for dosing people without their knowledge or consent, but also just setting up situations that were supposed to confront people with some sort of ineffable strangeness of the world that they would have to kind of freak out in order to deal with. So
that's almost Brechtian in a way, isn't it?
Yeah, or like the situationists, trying to heighten everything.
Pun intended, I suppose. Yeah. So the acid tests were like concerts that they put on and that the Merry Pranksters put on, and the Grateful Dead cut their teeth and started as a band at those events. They were very amateur at that stage, but that led into them getting their first record deal with Warner Brothers, and so they were still playing kind of rock and roll, but then it started to get more psychedelic, and yes, and you get in the album. The first album is a bit disappointing. I think it's quite fast, and in fact, a lot of their albums, their studio albums, are disappointing.
Well, I mean, that's one of the things that makes it difficult to recommend them, right? Is that you have to say, okay, so there's this band and they're amazing, but they have a tendency to expand their songs into like 20-minute jam sessions. So you have to be prepared to put a little bit of time in to get the good stuff. And also their studio albums tend not to really capture what's good about them very well. And that's kind of a commitment to expect somebody to make. I think one of the things about their studio albums, and there are a few other bands who have this experience as well, is that the Grateful Dead were evolving as musicians and as studio users at the same time as studio technology was evolving along with them. And so when I eventually get around to playing my song, it's off their album Oxamox Soa, which was one of, I believe, the first albums recorded on 16 track, because they would just happens to be in the right place at the right time to get access to 16 track tape as soon as that became available.
Yeah, I mean, this is probably at the time when record producers would go, "Aren't you happy with stereo?" I mean, that change had only happened quite recently, between mono and stereo sound. Yeah, I'm not so in on it as that, but certainly there are some real audio professionals in around the Grateful Dead scene, and one of them is the famous LSD chemist Owsley Stanley, and he helped pay for the sound system of the Grateful Dead, and also did recorded what he called sonic journals, which were just live recordings. And so many of these kind of still survive today. So yeah, we have that conversation about whether the Grateful Dead is a better band live or as a studio band, and then there are, because of all these live recordings, which are firstly those ones that Owsley took, but then later all sorts of fans came and recorded the concerts. And
the Grateful Dead were very encouraging of that, which is quite unusual, but meant that there was this kind of market for tapes, which really worked in their favor.
No, I wouldn't say it wasn't a market. So it was very specifically, you can trade tapes, but you cannot make money off them. So what people would do would send each other cassette tapes and then swap them around. So you would record the recording you had, and then they would send you something back. And that's how that went. Sorry, I just wanted to make it clear that there was not mercantile aspects to it at all.
No, but that the permissive atmosphere around that meant that actually in the long run a lot more people were exposed to the Grateful Dead than otherwise would have been if they had been more aggressive about pursuing copyright in the way that musicians are often encouraged to be.
That's for sure. And now, since that time, since the 1990s, I think the Grateful Dead have been releasing their own recordings of their live performances, and so they are taken straight from the soundboard and generally quite good. And depending on who the recorder was, they can be really good. So there are some boards, like they're called Bob and Betty boards, because they're named after the sound engineers who recorded them. Betty Cantor, I think her name was, and I forget Bob's name, but they were also around in the Grateful Dead family. So yeah, that's how that kind of happened. And so these kind of archivists and sound engineers are very long-lived, and some are still around. I think Dan Healy is still involved with the Dead, and they even took Grateful Dead fans on to work on the archives. So there's this guy called Dick Latvala who then started releasing this series of recordings called Dick's Picks, which I was playing one day and on a Chromecast to a television, and my eldest child came in and had a hissy fit because they thought it said dick pics. And it's just no,
it was a different time
of its time, different times. Yeah, who would have thought that we had? Yeah,
but
anyway,
I mean, one of the things that means, because there's this really extensive documentation of the Dead live in concert, you get things that they maybe only did once or twice as one-offs captured, or that they did a few times but that don't exist on studio albums captured.
Yeah.
And that means that you get these fascinating bits of like alternative musicology as well, by which I mean that in terms of psychedelic music, I cut my teeth on the Incredible String Band. That was a band I was raised on, and they do this song. They incorporate it into a much longer song. What's it even called? It's called "And I Bid You Good Night." Which
do they do that too?
They do, which they reckon they got from this Bahamian guitarist called Joseph Spence, who is a fascinating character we don't have time to get into. He's very strange. But
Harry Belafonte too, I think. So yeah, it's
well, and so the Grateful Dead had a period of doing that a cappella as a concert closer, and that was a dot that I never joined. But of course, like, it is very likely that they crossed paths with the string band, or that they were listening to one another. So it's interesting.
Or it's a very well known song at the time. Which
Well, that's the other thing.
I think a lot of folkies would have sung it as well, even if it was from the Bahamas. It was still canon folk, which is really interesting. I don't think we're going to have time to go into this, but that the Americana aspect that the Dead did with Working Man's Dead, kind of taking after the band released The Big Pink, and they thought, and they quite consciously kind of pared it down, the sound, and with the assistance of Crosby, Stills and Nash, really worked on their harmonies, and then kind of got back to the essence of a kind of American music. Yep, it's fascinating to me.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely, because you can kind of watch all of these different things percolate through their music, and then throughout the 70s and to some degree into the 80s, they get really interested in jazz, and so they'll do things like Terrapin Station and Blues for Allah, both of which are albums where one side of the LP is given over to a single extended, you would almost call it like a suite or something, where it moves through all of these different movements and has these different sections, and there's all of this very jazzy improvisation and expansiveness, and it's very different from the high speed straight ahead rock and roll at the start.
Yeah, that's for sure. Yes. So that really discursive kind of jazz thing started, I think, towards the mid 70s. And then continued in the 80s. But the 80s too, they started more exploration with some new recording abilities through MIDI. And so I can't quite remember what MIDI stands for, but
it's one of the really boring acronyms. It stands for Musical Instrument Digital Interface.
There you go.
It's just
so pretty much you can play your analog or digital music, and it will pick up what notes you're playing, and then you can play it, or it can come out of a speaker sounding like another instrument. So Jerry Garcia, instead of having to have all these guitar pedals and things, he can have this MIDI working and then can come out sounding like a trumpet or something. Or, this is 1980s trumpet instead of, the synth trumpets that you get today, which are better but still not like the real thing. But yeah.
No, I think people have just learned now that they're never going to be like the real thing, so instead they lean into it being different and find different ways to make it sound good. I think what we might do is I'll play my pick, and then we'll come back and round off. We have done a very shallow dive into the Grateful Dead because there's just such a ridiculously enormous amount to talk about, but I think I have ideas about where to go sum up. So this song I'm going to play you is from the album Oxamoxoa, which it is kind of an awkward middle child between the very, very psychedelic and strange Anthem of the Sun And yeah, Anthem of the Sun is great, but also it's one of the kind of great own goals in a number of ways. They made their lives incredibly difficult setting up this incredibly elaborate studio process, and then they lost half of it in the mastering process because they didn't understand what that was going to do to the mix. Oxomoxoa is similar in that it's got some really, really standout moments, and it's got a couple of tracks which are basically unlistenable because they relied on technology that didn't actually exist yet in order to do the thing they were trying to do. There's a song called What's Become of the Baby, which is just sort of like reverb and whispering. And
a lot of washed out. It's a really washed out sound. Yeah.
It's not good at all, but they were trying for something, which technically now I believe would be possible, but they didn't know how to do it at the time, and they tried to anyway. Anyway, the thing about Oxomoxoa is that it's considered by some people, and I guess I'm one of them, to be kind of the peak of them doing rock experimentation as opposed to the more discursive jazz experimentation that they went into. And I'll
go along with that. Yep.
This is the song that I think shows that off best because of the way it kind of moves through all of these phases and crams it all into 4.5 minutes. This is called Saint Stephen.
Saint Stephen with a rose, in and out of the garden he goes. Country garland in the wind and the rain, wherever he goes the people all complain. Stephen prosper in his time, well he may and he may decline. Did it matter, does it now? Stephen would answer if he only knew how. Fill it up and lower down again. Lady finger dipped in moonlight, writing what for across the morning sky. Sunlight splatters dawn with answer. Darkness struts and bids the day goodbye. Speeding arrow, sharp and narrow. What a lot of fleeting matters you have spurned. Several seasons with their treasons, wrap the babe in scarlet covers, call it your own. Did it doubt or did it try? Answers are plenty in the by and by. Talk about your plenty, talk about your ills. To one man gathers what another man spills. Saint Stephen will remain, all he lost he shall regain. Seashore washed by the suds and the foam, been here so long he's got to calling it home. Fortune comes a-crawling, Goliath a woman, spinning that closer to the answer man.
That was the Grateful Dead with Saint Stephen from the album Oxymoxoa, which it's probably my favourite. I think my like personally edited version of Oxymoxoa that takes out the completely unlistenable bits is probably my favourite.
Right, it's a very short St. Stephen that you've played for us there, Hugh.
Yes, yeah, it's a studio version. I mean, that is a good point to raise, is that every time you get a studio recording from the Grateful Dead, what it's attempting to do is sum up this band who will extend things out and extend things out and extend things out as long as the mood is good. And if you want to hear that, then you should check out live recordings. There's who is it?
We can get to that later. But
yeah. I was just thinking there's a specific website that does a Dead of the Day pick where they will give you like a kind of a curated video clip of the day that you can check out. And that's kind of a good way to dip in at random because they're not chronological or anything. So you'll get stuff from the 80s and then the next day stuff from the 70s or the 60s. And it's quite interesting. So, we are rapidly approaching time. I guess what I think I would like to do now is that ordinarily at towards the end, I like to ask people for kind of specific recommendations. And in this case, I mean, maybe we take a little bit more time with that because I think the challenge here is like, if someone's never heard of the Grateful Dead or thinks of them as kind of a shorthand for hippie excess, what would you suggest as like the ways in?
Well, if you really wanted to go with the hippie excess, I would suggest the book by Tom Wolfe called The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, which is an account of the acid tests. So this is when the Grateful Dead were starting, and it kind of sets out that milieu of the Grateful Dead and the Merry Pranksters together. Yeah. So that's how I would go. Mm-hmm. I think a really good way to start, if you have a music subscription, you can check out the Grateful Dead and then dip into some of their live recordings. It can be a bit daunting to know how to get in. You might want to try the series called Dick's Picks. I've recently been listening to a podcast series called 36 from the Vault, which is only recently finished. I'll repeat that, 36 from the Vault, and the two hosts went through and listened to all 36 of Dick's Picks and kind of talked about them. Now, I'm not suggesting you have to listen to them because I think they talked approaching possibly 2 hours sometimes for each one, and the recordings are quite long too. So, like sometimes they're 2 CDs, but they can get like to a 5 CD set for a concert, and they'll bring in 2 concerts that were around the same time. But also, the Grateful Dead YouTube channel is a great place to start. They will sometimes have clips there of live video recordings playing, and they've also got a selection of some of their albums or greatest hits albums. So there's the one that I started with because it was what was available in CD shops, called Skeletons from the Closet, which is their Warner Brothers years. And then there's they've got the Best of the Grateful Dead, the very best of the Grateful Dead, and the Best of the Grateful Dead Volume 2.
So
really imaginative. But that would be a good place to start.
Yep.
And also there's a movie there called The Grateful Dead Movie, another original title. And I think if you were to watch that, it's almost worth it just to see the animated intro itself, as well as the performances, and you get to see the venue being set up and broken down afterwards as well. So, which is kind of, and all the young people lining up to get their tickets and things. It's a really great thing to see.
My suggestion would be, music-wise, I would go with American Beauty and Workingman's Dead as a kind of like, that's the most accessible that the Grateful Dead got in terms of sounding like other music from the period. Like, Workingman's Dead is kind of the Grateful Dead, as you said, doing the band, and American Beauty is kind of the Grateful Dead doing Crosby, Stills and Nash a wee bit. I mean, it always sounds like the Grateful Dead. It doesn't sound like pastiche, but that's who they were kind of working with and thinking about. And so they're the most, I feel like, well-produced things that they did, even though my favourite's Oxomoxo, which is much messier. But
I agree with those two. They're certainly the most listenable for a tamed audience. One thing I would mention more is that the Grateful Dead has its own podcast, and they recently have been re-releasing the 50 years after the albums were originally released, a 50th anniversary edition. And along with that, they've been doing podcasts of the albums and going through the songs on some of them. So they did quite a deep dive into both those albums. And I think if you wanted to kind of go along with the songs and see what that was all about, I think you'd get a really good idea of how that all came about.
Yep. Also, the VH1 Behind the Music documentaries, the one of those on the Dead, which is called Anthem to Beauty and covers the period between Anthem of the Sun and American Beauty. That's very good. And books-wise, their ex-manager, a guy called Rock Scully, wrote a book called Living with the Dead, which is kind of disreputable and scurrilous, but is a very interesting subjective account of what it was like. There's also a book called A Long Strange Trip, which is written by a guy called Dennis McNally, who I think was kind of adopted into the Grateful Dead family in the course of writing the book and kind of toured around with them for a while, collecting information.
I think that's really well regarded as far as I know.
Yeah. I really liked that one because he doesn't spare them. You know, when he feels like they done wrong, he lets you know it, and he's quite willing to kind of be warts and all about the ways that they kind of let themselves and others down in a number of occasions.
Yeah.
All right. We are pretty much out of time. So do you have, Michael, anything that you would like to plug, or just, be nice to your local librarian?
I have nothing to plug. No, yeah, that's right. I'm a librarian. I have nothing to plug. Yeah.
Yep. But be nice to librarians and listen to Cory Doctorow's podcast. Both of those.
For sure. Yeah. And make a submission on a bill if you feel strongly about it.
Yep, that's a good idea. Well, thank you very much, Michael.
All right, cheers, Hugh. Lovely talking to you.
You've been listening to Reserved Recommendations, a radio show and podcast from Manawatu People's Radio, Te Reo Irirangi o ngā tangata o Manawatu. The show was produced and presented by me, Hugh Dingwall, and I also composed our theme music. It's called Sack Jazz, and you can find it at wolfboy.bandcamp.com. If you enjoyed this show, why not go ahead and share it with a friend? You can find the last 10 episodes at npr.nz/show/reserved or wherever else you get your podcasts. If you want an episode older than that, try searching for Reserved Recommendations on YouTube. You can find me on Twitter at Objective Realty, or you can follow the show on Facebook. And finally, Manawatu People's Radio is a non-profit community access station. If you like this or any other piece of their fine audio programming, why not fling them $1 or $2? You can go to npr.nz/donate for more information on how to do that.